Good afternoon, everyone. Here we are for our second quarter manufacturing economic outlook with some really interesting, and I say interesting, sometimes with a little positive spin, sometimes with a little bit of an uncertain spin, but interesting nevertheless. And particularly the elephant in the room is, of course, that stuff around US tariffs and US trade. And we've seen something really interesting come through in the data sort of already this quick, only in the second quarter. So that'll be interesting to talk about. As usual, what I'll do is I'll go over some of the key findings and points, and then we'll interrogate some of the metrics one by one with some illustrations to help follow along with what I'm saying. So if I could have the first slide, please. So overall, what we see in the core performance metrics, that's output and orders, rather diminutive. So an improvement on last quarter in terms of output. We actually, some might say it's a little boom, but it's output that has boomed a little bit without any demand growing in kind. So it's a short-term blip in increase in output, but unfortunately, there's not enough demand as proxied by orders for us to be confident in the coming quarter or the coming two quarters that we'd expect to see output to grow. In terms of that balance between, this is the second bullet point, the balance between domestic demand and export demand. Export has continued, as it has done really over the past year or so, has continued to prop up that total demand figure. However, the total scale of export demand isn't particularly massive, and we'll see that on the next slide as well, in a couple of slides' time, I should say. So I would hesitate drawing any conclusions to really suggest that export growth is happening in earnest. Really important point. This is on point three, and I'll save talking about the nuance of that until I get to that slide. But some really interesting data and revelations about supply side inflation as measured by the ONS and ourselves, and some interesting points there, and really important points about revision to national statistics data that might mean that inflation is a lot higher than has been previously estimated in the sector. Now, employment's growing a little bit, but actually vacancies are coming way down, down to almost levels that we saw pre-COVID, on the long run average pre-COVID, so that normal vacancy rate. What does this mean? Again, it's cautious. It requires a little nuance and understanding because, of course, you could say that vacancies have been filled, but in many instances they haven't. It's just they've been pulled from the market because they're surplus to requirement now. So seeing that vacancies number come down isn't necessarily always a good thing. The second really important point following on from that cost point is in investment. We're seeing some rather chilling data in investment, data about intentions that we haven't seen for 3 to 4 years, or really since the post-COVID period. Now, confidence throughout all this, despite these metrics, the business sentiment confidence remains robust. There's a few levers to this. The overarching one often being, of course, the relative stability of the manufacturing business environment in this year, and indeed for a lot of last year as well, has been far more stable than any time in the previous 5 years, really. So that's what we think that's driving a lot of that sentiment remaining robust, despite those core performance metrics remaining rather pedestrian. But here we come to the forecast, and if I just draw your attention to the bottom point there, the manufacturing GVA forecast, you'll see what's the important thing to look at here is 2026. So 2025, pretty much a flat forecast at minus 0.2. And in 2026, again, flat, marginally negative, but, effectively flat. And having such a pedestrian forecast for 2026 this early on in 2025 is quite revealing of the current mood of forecasting for the sector at the minute about potential long aggregate growth in the coming 2 to 3 quarters, where there's not that much of a silver lining, particularly when we offset it. What's driving a lot of this sort of pedestrian pessimism? Because I'm cautious with the use of the word pessimism here, because as you can see, it's effectively zero. It's not necessarily negative, but that is pessimistic in its own right. It's through those investment intentions. We're already seeing in 2025, we're seeing those really creep down into flat, heading towards negativity, which then will fuel that downward revision on that, particularly in that longer run 2026 forecast. So if I can have the next slide, please. Now we'll look at some of those metrics one by one. So first of all, we're looking at output and orders. If I just draw your attention to the far right, I'll give my usual health warning here, which is where you're seeing these bars, output in red and orders in orange. What they do not represent is an absolute increase in any one of those concerns. So where you might see it at the 40% mark, it does not mean that output in that quarter increased 40%. What it represents, the proportion of industry that saw an increase versus a decrease in whatever concern it might be, output or orders, in that given quarter. Now, on the far right, you'll see here that actually just in 25 Q1, so the penultimate grouping of bars, we actually saw output and orders post negative balance figures, which, despite being a bit of a sensational thing to say, is the first time they've done that since COVID, if you draw your attention to around the 2020 Q2, 2020 Q3 area. Although the total scale of that negativity was relatively slight. Now in 2025 Q2, we have output grow, which is good, and it's encouraging, but it's very likely to be a short-term blip because we have the orders not there to support it. And likewise, in the previous quarter, we didn't have the demand growing in a sort of consistent fashion. So this doesn't leave us with a particularly enthused for Q3 or Q4 that we'd expect to see demand come through. It's likely that this was, extraordinary activity in the industry in the past quarter that has delivered that relative increase in output for a small proportion of the sector. But on aggregate, that demand isn't growing. It's effectively pretty flat. Now let's have the next slide, and then we'll talk about that orders breakdown. When I mentioned that exports have been propping up the total order pile. So what you're looking at here is the blue line represents those total orders, which is actually the same as that orange bar from the previous chart. And now the red and orange bars in this chart shows how those total orders are sort of made up, how much of it is in terms of the sector, suggesting how much is UK orders growth and change in quarter to quarter, and how much export orders growth change quarter to quarter. Now, if we look at just the bars just to the left of the green box bar, you'll see that UK orders ever so slight negativity, and export orders, modest positivity. But this has been a phenomenon you can sort of see that's been going on now for pretty much about a year and a half, where you see in pretty much most quarters that export orders are sort of in that modest positive territory, and normally domestic orders are so close to flat balance of change that you can barely see them on the chart. The only thing I would caution here is that this does not, I would not surmise from this that, great, export growth is significant. It just shows that in that total, where that blue line is still relatively diminutive, where of that diminutive level of activity, a lot of it is being driven by exporters versus domestic in this data. Now, let's look at the green box bar for a second, and what this represents. And anytime you see a green box bar in the following slides, this represents the sector's future expectations. So that's not our forecast, but that's the sector thinking about what it expects to see in the next 3 months. So, in the third quarter of this year. Now, what we've seen really for the past coming up to a year and a half now is a very consistent over optimism in these concerns, and we'll see it in the next slide, where the sector suggests to us that right around the corner, we're going to see a serious boost in demand, in both UK demand and export demands that doesn't quite manifest. So if we can have the next slide, please. And what you'll see here is effectively an overlaying of those what the sector thought would happen in the coming quarter, those expectations, and then what actually came to pass when we gather the data from the sector, 3 months later. So let me draw your attention to the far right as usual, and you see the bars represent those expectations that were set in the previous quarter for output and orders, and the dots represent what actually came to pass. So you can see this illustrates is sort of ignoring the final grouping on the right and looking at the general spread of maybe the 3 to 4 previous. You can see that the dots are regularly beneath those bars, and it has been almost for 2 years now there. We can see here in this quarter, drawing your attention again back to the far right bar, you can see that actually the output expectation was far more sober. It was a bit more bang on compared to what had previously been the trend of the sector overestimating those expectations. But orders came in, beneath those expectations. But what does potentially that optimism or that over optimism is finally cooling off, and particularly when we contrast this in a few slides' time with what we're seeing with those investment intentions, that potentially that 2 years of sort of right, it's around the corner. It's here comes the boom that we've been so expecting for consecutive quarters. Finally, that sentiment might have gone to ground. Now, on the next slide, please, and I think this is a really interesting takeaway, and what's quite funny is the most interesting thing about this page is what's not on it. Now, what you're looking at here is effectively for these various subsectors, but just let's look at the green box bar for the minute, which represents the aggregate of all the manufacturing sector. It represents, for when we ask the sector, where you have seen new demand, export demand, where has that originated from? So, Europe is always typically the largest, Asia and the Middle East. Now, this is the first time in manufacturing looks history, I believe, that North America hasn't featured in the top three. Actually, it's almost always second place. The Middle East and Oceania, which isn't on this, we only show the top three. Often trade places, but North America has always been there in second. So Why did I say, oh, the most interesting thing about this chart is that what's not here is because North America doesn't feature here. Now, why? And this data, of course, was taken before, yesterday's announcement about tariffs. It was taken potentially about, 3 to 4 weeks ago when it was analyzed. And what this represents is that hesitation that we potentially infamously might have seen it in the news in the market that the sector, both sides of the pond, are taking a break to see how those will bite. And it's interesting to see that those demand conditions, that sort of hesitation has filtered through into this data where North America's always featured in the top three of where there is new export demand. It's some of that's represented by North America. It's not here in this quarter, so dropping down into fourth place and not represented in this chart. Particularly interesting to see that sort of in hard data happen relatively swiftly. Of course, we think that this potentially won't be a permanent fixture. We know we've heard from a lot of members that a lot of this is holding off on shipments, waiting to see, because many members will say, well, we've got stuff, in freight, and we're not quite sure what it'll get hit with when it lands, given the sort of very, very malleable nature of the situation. So as a result of that, a lot of people are holding off. But whether that means hold off and then eventually, most likely so, then be pushed through, particularly involving today's announcements, particularly around cars. We know a lot of members have been holding off, particularly on car shipments, while that uncertainty's been about. So it's quite possible in the third quarter that we actually might see a boom in that North American Demand Commission if that certainty meets through, and now what's been held off for a quarter now filters through. But we'll definitely be attuned to that come next quarter, and we'll start to talk about prices and margins. And this is, I suppose, these two central slides here are potentially the most important and I think the biggest takeaways. So what you're looking at here is a price setting behavior as represented by the bars. So the red bars represent UK price setting behavior, and the orange bars represent export price setting behavior, and the lines beneath it represent UK margins and export margins, respectively. Now, what's interesting here is that you might just notice that we've had that COVID period 21 to 2020 to 23 where the mountain is big, basically, as a sort of amusing fact. That's the highest those bars have ever been in Manufacturing Outlook's 30-year history. But that's not the point. If we look to the far right, you'll see that price setting behavior consistently, really over the past 2 years, has come, the level is settled way down from the highs of COVID, but critically, it hasn't gone into contraction. Now, this is important because we have, as provided, and it's national statistic provided by the Office for National Statistics, the ONS. There's something called producer price inflation, which is PPI, which is very similar to consumer price inflation that we all might be familiar with in the news, talking about, the average price of milk, bread, basket, cost of living, that sort of stuff. Now, producer price inflation is a very similar concept, except it sort of measures itself off a basket of inputs for the production sector. So you think, commodities, so on and so forth. And so what it really represents is supply side inflation. Now, what's important here is that the ONS for the past, a long time, probably since COVID, has been almost at loggerheads in terms of the data we've been suggesting, because our data has consistently showed that price setting behavior, while cooling within the sector, is still growing quarter to quarter or on balance. Whereas, particularly in the past 6 months, PPI suggested that it's been, -3%, -2% year on year. And that's always left our head scratching a little bit. And particularly when we talk to members where they say, well, we're certainly not seeing contraction in pricing. And the point here is that the ONS has just pulled it as a national statistic because they've realized it's been discovered there's been a methodological error in the process, potentially dating back to 2008. And what they've said so far is they're not quite sure of the scale, but what it means is that supply side inflation has been underestimated, and in their words, not mine, for quite some time. The degree of which they haven't really given much of a clue to. But why is this important that some sort of figure in the statistics stage has been underestimated? Well, because it's a very important figure that's used by Treasury, used by the Bank of England around considering for setting base rates and those sorts of things, and the Office of Budget Responsibility. So it really is a core measure, and of course, as a designated national statistic, a lot of government stakeholders will be looking at that as a measure of inflation in the economy that beyond the consumer economy. And so the fact that it's been, by the ONS's own statement that it's been underestimated for some time means that actually, particularly those in the bank, will be thinking, perhaps inflation's been underestimated. And I suppose it's a little bit, I suppose, not enthusing, but what's the right word for it? Um, at least it's slight confirmation that our data hasn't been barking entirely up the wrong tree, because anecdotally between members and our data, we've definitely not seen prices within the sector retreat. They've grown at a slower rate. Now, confidence. So this is that sentiment I was talking about that remains remarkably high. And so just to set the scene here, the five line in the middle is the inflection point between positivity and negativity. So if we just look at the far right, over the past few quarters, you can see, particularly given the past few slides that we've talked about, and we've seen that output and orders hasn't been very strong for quite some time. And we're about to talk a little bit about investment as well. Those intentions going down that we're yet to see. But sentiment confidence, based on the aggregation of the business's views of their own business, which is the red line, and then the orange line, which is the aggregation of the sector's view on the wider UK economy, remains remarkably robust. There was a slight divot a couple of quarters ago, but what I mentioned at the start was that a lot of this we're putting down to, particularly over the past year or so, year and a half, 2 years or so, we see that line is remarkably robust and straight and growing steadily in a period where the performance metric growth hasn't been great. We think a lot of this is around the mood music of the sector, where the relative, as I mentioned at the start, the relative stability of the trading environment has been incredibly stable relative to any time in the past for the prior 4 to 5 years, which we're thinking is giving a lot of that, oh, it's better than it was sentiment, because of course this metric is just based on the sector's sentiment and not based on any sort of harder performance data that we're seeing. Because so we'll contrast this with the next slide, which is on investment intention. So these are two hard things that are difficult to reconcile when you see sentiment confidence is up, and then we see the orange line here. So I was talking about this at the start, investment intention. So what this represents, this orange line here, and the red bars represent employment, but I'll get to that in a moment. This is a unique metric in our package because this looks forward 12 months. So it's elicited quarterly, but it's looking forward for investment capital expenditure intentions over the next 12 months, so a year ahead. And which is why I mentioned it's fueling a lot of that 2026 suppression in the forecast. Now that orange line, you can see it's been hovering around that sort of same moderately positive line for about 2 years. But now, particularly over the past 2 quarters, you can see it's been on a very strong downward trajectory, approaching zero now in this latest quarter's data. And this is quite significant because in this same period, this is the period where effectively we've had, well, the now defunct, some of the most welcome pro-business investment policies come into play. The now defunct super deduction, the permanency of the annual investment allowance, the introduction of full expensing. So the levers there, in order to support the sector if it wants to invest. But what we can see here is the sector doesn't want to invest because, of course, investment decisions are ultimately governed by prevailing economic headwinds, of which the sector deems is not the right time. But this of course weighs on those forecasts and weighs on aspirations for forecasting for the sector in the coming quarter, particularly when if it continues on this trajectory, we wouldn't have seen the last time we saw those investment intentions go this low or go into negativity was either, of course, COVID, and that following little divot in about 2022 was to do a combination of the energy crisis and the post-COVID boom subsequent crash, if you would. But a minor crash, but we all might remember that, the post-inflationary crash after the surge of activity after COVID, which then brought about and compounded the energy crisis problem. But why that's relevant is that that was an acute issue. So, there's always a thought, and it's as demonstrated by that little V there in 2022. It's acute. You can put it down to it, so you're quietly confident that once this abates, no matter how, I don't know if it takes a long or slow time. Same with COVID, it will abate, and then it'll return. With this suppression investment intentions, it's hard to chalk it up to much geopolitical stuff at the minute, potentially a little bit of tariffs, but we don't think that's dictating domestic investment intentions at the minute. And so that's why, actually, despite it not being negative, it's more concerning because there's not an acute phenomenon that's dragging that down at the moment. And so if that's just the general standard pace of the trajectory of the sector's investment intentions, then we've really got to keep our eyes open for Q3. Now, onto employment. You can see employment pretty flat. If we just look to the left of the green box bar, that's that red box. You might be able to barely see it. Pretty much no change result there. And then the green box bar seems very big, but as always with employment, particularly employment, this less so represents what the sector expects to see in employment growth in the next quarter, but it just illustrates the demand for labor. So if I had them all up on the screen, you'd see actually in the past it's been far taller. So it's cooling down and cooling down, excuse me, cooling down in line with those vacancies, that vacancies data that I mentioned, which I'll just give you a couple of stats on that now. So um, we like to talk about it often in this presentation to complement the employment data. Now, the peak of vacancies I'm going to talk about as a ratio was around that sort of post-COVID bounce back period, 2021, early 2022. was 4.1 jobs vacant in the manufacturing sector per every 100 employed. Now, pre-COVID, going back 20 years, the long run average, so the standard floor for vacancies in the sector is 1.8 vacant jobs per every 100 employed. Now, that's been slowly coming down at sort of slow speed, speeding up a little, slowing down. But interestingly, as of this month, it's down to two, I believe, 2.0 jobs vacant in the sector for every 100 employed, which is remarkably close and getting very close to that 1.8 figure, which is effectively, you could then say the average vacancy rate within the sector is the same as it was at the 20-year average pre-COVID, which has definitely taken some years to get there. Now, what's more difficult is you say, well, is this a good or a bad thing? Because vacancies alone doesn't tell you everything. It tells you something about the demand for labor in the market, but when they reduce, you've got two questions. They've either closed because they've been filled, or they've closed because they're now surplus to requirement. Now, when we marry that to our red bar data here, if we're looking at the just to the left of the green box bar, when we see vacancy rates come down quarter on quarter on national statistics data in the sector, and then we see our employment activity sort of tracker here, which has been flat to negative in the past 2 quarters, we can conclude or sort of surmise that those vacancies have come down. They're coming down not so much so because they've been filled in the large, but because they've been pulled from the market because they're surplus to requirement, which then follows in tandem with some of the suppressed metrics and critically as well reduced investment intentions. So on to the next slide, please. And this is effectively the final slide. These are just the forecasts. I think we've talked about these a little bit, and they're on the final slide. So I'll just skip to the final slide. You're not missing anything here. This is exactly what you're seeing. If I have the final slide, please. What you're seeing there is in the bottom two bullet points. But I just really want to focus on taking two things away here because there's been a lot this quarter, a lot of arguably some of it a bit confusing and hard to conclude. So I'll just focus the mind quickly. I think the two really important points to take away is the third point and the second point on investment. The third point is around it, it's now been announced that the National Statistics Body suggests that supply side inflation has been sort of consistently underestimated since 2008, but that's not so much of a concern. The concern is really those estimations in the past, 4 to 5 years of that heightened base rate environment. How much of now the bank's relaxation that's been happening over the past year or so on base rates, it's now going to be put into check, depending on that review, suggesting that potentially on the hard data now we might see the ONS announce that inflation on the supply side has been much higher than expected. Now, the fourth point, that's investment intentions. This is the biggest alarm. I mean, the third one, potentially arguably a bit more of an academic exercise, talking about, inflation being underestimated. The fourth one, investment intentions creeping down without a major driver to do so, is the heart of this matter. Of course, there's things right. What could potentially perfect timing for industrial strategy. Some might say, that it needs to come in and turn those sentiments around because, of course, we've got the sentiment analysis on confidence that seems remarkably high. But in terms of money where the mouth is, those capex intentions, they are coming down, which is driving a lot of that 2026 sort of pedestrian forecast at minus 0.5%. So thank you very much. I'll stop there and hand you back to Richard.
Thanks, James. There's quite a lot in there, isn't there? I guess I absolutely totally agree with the kind of the leading indicator of investment being the kind of canary in the coal mine somewhat in terms of what the future might hold. Yeah, I think the other things around, kind of just in terms of US collapse, in terms of where that sits on the list, it doesn't even exist anymore on the list currently. And it'll be interesting to see how the announcements that came out just in the last 24 hours may change that sentiment somewhat. But it's one of those things where it takes a little bit of time, and the question is what else might come out of that. Be good to get your observations on that as to whether we've actually got a nailed down agreement now or whether it's the start of something broader. Don't know if you want to comment on that at all, James.
Yeah, sure. So, obviously yesterday's news is good. We've been in contact. I think for example, there's mixed views on it because of course there's a camp that says, well, it's better than it was, in terms of 4 months ago, particularly, with certainty and what the tariffs are looking like then. But is it better than it was 12 months ago? And that's the question, I think. May saying it's define your starting point, really. Um, the elephant in the room is, let's consider, a household name manufacturer for automotive because that's what it's about. The major part of the major announcement yesterday is those 100,000 allowance for cars. Now, of course, they'll certainly this manufacturer will be very happy about it. This is a manufacturer that exports a lot to the US, and I'm sure we can all allude to who we're thinking about. But that's actually that 100,000 allowance for the UK is beneath what this one manufacturer ships to the US in yet. So it's certainly a good step, and I'll certainly be happy about it. But it's sort of far from it doesn't even cover the export from the one largest car exporter, let alone the entire market. I think as far as confidence is concerned, I think the main benefit of this will be easing the lever on any withheld shipments and any pause in that trans trade that has clearly demonstrably taken a pause, as shown in the data that we just talked about when I sort of bemusingly said what's interesting about this chart is what's not here in North America. I think it'll go ways to doing that. But in terms of the meat and cheese of the agreement, of course, there's a lot in the air, around steel and our sister organization, UK Steel, seeking more clarity, particularly around on, melting and pouring requirements. It's still quite uncertain around metals, as well. But you'd be remiss to say it's not a step in the right direction. But the argument the criticism would be, where's your starting point?
Yeah, so
It's
it's kind of two
better than four
steps.
months ago, potentially not better than
Yeah,
12 months ago,
yeah,
and a
two
lot of
steps
it's being
back and one step
uncertainty.
forward. Yeah, exactly. I guess the other thing that came out from looking at the data was that the the view of the future is quite starkly different between some of the larger manufacturers and some of the smaller ones. And I guess you can come up with some theories around why that might be, and that could well be that larger manufacturers have greater visibility and also understand overseas supply markets maybe slightly better, slightly more sophisticated, and they're at the front end of the supply chain rather than, tier one, tier two manufacturers. But that's the other thing that came out from the data set that I saw was that larger manufacturers have a more positive view of the world than the smaller manufacturers in the survey. It'd be good to get your thoughts on that as well, and then we'll move
Yeah,
on.
it's really, I mean, and there's something we observed through arguably every sort of bathtub and jump up in the past few years, and I suspect it's a phenomenon of the sector ongoing forever, is that the SME population, which obviously, well, not obviously, I mean, I share, it makes up by way and afar over 95% in terms of volume, but not in value of the pop manufacturing business population. Um, they're always in the data, the ones particularly to pull back on investment first. It's those larger companies that naturally have the capital freedom to ride the wave, take a larger risk. But what's particularly pertinent for these large companies, particularly in the UK, with such integrated supply chains and so many manufacturers sit in the middle of that value chain, that many large companies are finding. We see it from household name primes, that there's a real need to take the supply chain, those SME supply chains, along with you on the journey because alternative supply may not be available, particularly with the sort of a new reduction in supply opportunities post COVID for many product lines, business lines in the UK. Seeing a supplier, a particular SME business that might be the way down in a prime supply chain, if that is faltering or failing to make those investments, those primes really have to look down in their own interest, and see what's going to happen. Because if they lose that for example, the critical business in that chain, finding an alternative might be prohibitively costly and inconvenient, in terms of keeping up output. So it's something that we see, and particularly when it comes to recovery, we see out of one of these divots, we see those large businesses are quicker to do it, often as well because they've had the freedom, for lack of a better word, to invest, or the foresight to invest through whatever that period is. So it means on the other side, that they're not often starting from a sort of liquidity zero position that's infamously post-COVID so many SMEs did.
Yeah. Thank you, James. We'll bring you back in to the Q&A because I think some of the conversation we'll be having around net zero obviously plays through to broader industrial strategy, which we were obviously anticipating getting some paperwork out and receiving some paperwork from government earlier this month. That still hasn't come through, and I think the likelihood is towards the end of this month now. But it'd be good to get your views on that during the Q&A session. James, thank you very much. As usual, excellent. As I said, we're moving across now, and it may seem slightly strange. We're talking about energy prices being incredibly high. We're talking about headwinds increasing, etc. But we're going to switch the conversation around net zero. And when we talk about net zero, it's profitable and value delivering net zero that we're talking about here. It's the value in reducing emissions, reducing your energy consumption, improving efficiency, and making your business sustainable going forwards as well. So important to underline that when we talk about net zero, there clearly is a commercial aspect to that, rather than a maybe a slightly more evangelical view of the world that some people may have. But clearly, moving towards a net zero agenda, one should drive out cost as part of that process, but also may, in the longer term, deliver competitive advantage for manufacturers as well. So it's one that's worth thinking about in the present for immediate usage, for reducing our energy usage or maximizing yield in terms of productivity. But also there are opportunities in the long term. Overlay on that, you've got compliance requirements that are starting to hit the market and have done in Europe and has a follow-on effect in terms of UK manufacturers. It's worth thinking about how you can use net zero as a tool and an opportunity to drive value, not be seen as a burden for manufacturers. So in that context, as I said, I'm being joined by two experts in the area with very relevant and specific expertise and practical expertise as well. So I'm being joined by Howard Lungley. So Howard, thank you very much for joining us. Howard's BDO's head of carbon advisory. He spent the last, I don't know, 25 plus years working around carbon management for large blue chip companies, including BT, but also for engineering businesses and also in management consulting as well. So, Howard, thank you very much for joining us. And I'm delighted that we're also being joined by Andy Redfern, who's the founder and CEO of Chartwell Consulting. Andy, welcome. Andy's business is a great example of practical use of yield optimization and manufacturing optimization to drive both cost efficiency and also driving towards that net zero agenda as well. So, Andy, thank you very much for joining us as well. Andy's team, just for reference, BDO have a strategic relationship with Andy. We've got a strategic partnership, and we draw on Andy and his team's really deep engineering expertise to support clients in terms of understanding the size of a challenge and the opportunity for businesses as well to drive greater efficiency, especially around process industries and engineering as well. So, Andy, lovely to have you with us as well. Just in terms of what we've been doing, obviously there's an overlay in terms of what we've got out of the latest quarterly report in terms of market sentiment, but we will also provide some additional, I guess, survey information around businesses and their view towards net zero as well. And I think that's been quite an interesting set of data, mainly throwing out that just the whole net zero strategy and where businesses are looking at net zero is pretty much 50% of the people that we surveyed don't have a plan whatsoever around net zero. And that's even when you look at it between large businesses and small businesses, the variance between the two is quite minimal. And your initial hypothesis would be that the big guys have got everything in place and everything's fantastic, and the small guys are trying to work out how they fit into that broader supply chain and also what it means for them. But what we've actually seen is that irrespective of the size of business, there seem to be 50% of people have no plan whatsoever, which is interesting, which is why kind of my opening sort of commentary was around when you think about net zero, it's not just carbon. There's a clear value proposition and profitability proposition that goes with that as well. Andy, I'm going to come to you first. Obviously, in terms of the survey results that we got around net zero, it'd be great to get your observations as well. But also thinking about, in terms of whether there's any variance around sectors, subsectors as well within manufacturing. It'd be good to get your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Richard. Really interesting data set. And I think one of the things that stood out for me was there was a relatively high proportion of the respondents that said that the commitment to net zero as a priority is high. And a large proportion of the applicant or the respondents said that. However, the proportion of them then said that it was a priority for their business was substantially lower. There was that drop off, which I think speaks to, well, the priorities for businesses have to be about being viable, have to be about being profitable, and bringing those two elements of what we all want to see in terms of the direction of travel with net zero and keeping our businesses viable and profitable are important. On the sector front, I think the message that sort of came out for me looking at the sectors were the sectors which said that they were optimistic about their orders and optimistic about the likelihood of business in the future were also the ones that had more confidence and had a higher priority around net zero, which again I think speaks to that same point. Yes, if you've got a good strong pipeline, your confidence in your business profitability, then we can focus on net zero. I'm sure we'll come on to it. I think there's actually more overlap between net zero and profitability, perhaps, than immediately meets the eye. But maybe we'll come on to that in a minute.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Andy. I mean, Howard, just your thoughts and sort of building on Andy's comments there, and in terms of sort of net zero being not just it's one of those things that you have on your to-do list, but seems to drop down quite on a regular basis out of the top five. But it'd be good to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, really interesting. I think net zero, it's really one of these longer term mega trends that is there in the background all the time. It's not pulled out in the weekly, monthly fluctuations that we've seen in some of those data points. But it's there and it's increasing and it's getting more and more important. So, climate change is intensifying, it's accelerating. It's a huge problem for humanity. What can an individual business do about it? Well, they probably don't need to think in terms of my net zero plan in order to save the planet. They probably need to think about how am I going to stay competitive in a market where everybody else is decarbonising. And they're decarbonising because of technology change, because of government policy, because of increasing prices on carbon emissions. So it's really, I think what is interesting to me is that there's probably less of an overt focus on net zero for net zero's sake. It's more of a focus on how do I remain competitive in this future, which is already influenced heavily by climate change and the net zero transition, but that's just going to accelerate. It's going to become more of a risk and or an opportunity for businesses, depending on how well they can adapt.
Yeah. I think the other thing is that there's that practical element, which is, look, you can talk about net zero and you can put it in your ivory tower and think about intellectually, that's fantastic. But knowing manufacturers like we all do, it's down to actually, how do we do this? What's it going to do to my business? How can I maximize profitability at the same time? What can I do about my working capital? It's all part of the mix of, look, if I can improve the performance of my business whilst also achieving my net zero targets, that's the holy grail stuff, right? And Andy, on that, obviously you're working closely with quite a few businesses, everything from really large multinationals down to kind of smaller SME businesses as well. It'd be good to get your thoughts and some examples of kind of where businesses are doing it right, so to speak.
Yes, thank you. And look, manufacturers have understood the need for driving efficiency, for decades now. This is the bread and butter of working in manufacturing. Efficiency improvement, generally, people will have ideas, they'll have strategies around improving the labor efficiency, perhaps, or improving capacity, or perhaps improving material usage. Energy saving has very often been the thing that's come last. Perhaps we'll have some capital expenditure projects coming down the line, but when it comes to optimizing the existing asset base for energy, it's very much considered to be, it's the change down the back of the sofa. Maybe we'll get to it at some point. That's changed. I think we all know the cost of energy at the moment is about 30% higher in the UK than it is across continental Europe, and it's nearly 3 to 4 times higher here than it is in the United States. The cost of energy is such an important part of the cost base of a manufacturer right now that this is much higher on the priority list. So you invited me to talk about a case study or two, but if we start with perhaps some of the largest consumers of energy, these are typically the big process industries like chemicals, like steel production. If you take a typical plant that may be spending £40 million a year on their energy use, and work with that team with a really simple methodology: measure, analyze, and trial. Where are we in our process? What are the largest energy consumers that we have on our site? And if we take one example, perhaps the largest energy consumer could be, for example, the blowers that transport air into combustion units for burning off some of the waste products and the byproducts before those products can be processed and put into the environment. That can easily be £4-5 million a year in electricity consumption in these large blowers. But when you look at the way that they were optimized for running, it was when energy prices were so much lower. And perhaps we've got 20 or 30% excess flow going through that process that we need. If we get really close to the detail, measure it closely, analyze it with the right group of people, we can see this potential for optimization. Trial those improvements, trial running at higher levels of optimization, and we can find £500,000 savings perhaps in the first project. Then move on to the next one. And by the time you've got 3, 4, 5 of these projects onto your belt, we're very quickly talking about 10% of the total energy usage on site being something that can be saved without any capital expenditure at all. It can be quite remarkable.
Yeah, it's one of those interesting ones that actually, if you kind of stood back and went, do you know, what's the biggest way that we're going to drive towards net zero? Actually, and high energy prices it focuses the mind rather quickly, doesn't it? And I'm just thinking of one of my clients where they were basically a food manufacturer, food and drink, well, food actually, chilled food and frozen, chilled and frozen for the multiples. On every high street, you'll come across some of their products, white label stuff. But they again, obviously refrigeration is a big part of their cost base. So obviously there's stuff to running the production line, but they've got big refrigeration units and freezing units as part of their footprint, manufacturing footprint. And they basically set their freezers to a certain temperature on the assumption that people will be going in and out, FLTs will be going in and out of the warehouses on a regular basis. So they had to set a lower a target temperature. But what they didn't do is to go, do you know what? We only function on a 2-shift basis, and there's 8 hours in the evening where nothing actually happens, and therefore we can be slightly more smart in terms of how we set our temperatures, whilst also achieving our obviously regulatory requirements in terms of chilling. So that saved a decent chunk of money for them, for no change in productivity or performance whatsoever. So there are always these things that you can think about. Some of them will be small, but we're not talking about turn the lights off when you go away. It's where you need a sufficient level of understanding of usage, what we're using it for, etc. And I guess that the energy prices, is driving a bit more focus around that.
Well, if I can pick up on that point about usage, very often, particularly perhaps for some of the smaller energy consumers, the only information they really know about how much energy they're consuming is when they receive the bill at the end of the month. Yeah. And of course, if I come back to that idea of measure, analyze, trial, if your only measurement is how much you're spending each month, it's very hard to know what to focus on. Another client in the ready mix cement and concrete industry, you
like the good ones, Andy.
This is where our economy is built on, Richard, as you well know. And they will have a really important role to play in construction projects, in building our infrastructure around us. But the electricity and in those cases, predominantly electricity bills will come through once a month. No real concept of where that energy is actually being used, other than just a little bit of finger in the air. It's so easy and so inexpensive today to be able to get hold of electrical current clamps. You can just put those around different parts of the process, around the cabling. You can log the data, and start to build up profiles showing how the energy is being used during the course of the day. We did this with one client, and they discovered that, yes, during the peak period when they're using all of their equipment, there was 165 kilowatts of energy being used, or kilowatts of power, but there's a base level of 60 kilowatts being used all of the time, throughout the weekend, throughout the night, when this plant's never been run. It's a bit like the story of don't leave your television on standby overnight because it's still consuming electricity. Well, it's the same with many of these motors and with many of these sort of large industrial plants. Unless you actually start looking at it and seeing the profile, you don't really understand or don't really know where your energy is actually going. And a lot of this can very easily be saved with some simple switching and simple changes to the way that we operate the equipment.
Yeah. Howard, sort of bring you in on this as well. I mean, we've obviously talked about, look, there are, you can almost triage net zero opportunities and align them to profitability improvement as well. But it might be worth sort of just sharing a little bit of your thoughts around that as well.
Yeah, thank you. I was just thinking, so what Andy's describing there are the kind of the no-brainer actions. Yeah, so the opportunities that will reduce your carbon and will save you costs without any significant outlay. They're either no cost to implement or very low cost, and that those are the things that you should do now. And I like to think of the strategic journey to net zero as having three main components, and that's the first component. There's no excuse to delay. Just get on with it and start reaping the benefits. The second category is a sort of a plan for these changes category, and they typically have some upfront cost, but only if you look at it as a separate action that maybe you think is a change you wouldn't have to make anyway. But I'm talking about things like improving insulation or upgrading plant, where there's a clear business case. There's a payback, in other words, over a period of time, but it makes commercial sense. You plan for it because it requires you to develop a business case. You may want to sequence the implementation of those initiatives so that you're only replacing plant when they get to the end of life anyway. But nevertheless, it's commercially sensible activity. It just may be a bit more complex. We can't just get on with it today, but you should plan for it next year and the year after. And then the third category is those solutions which are not yet commercially viable. So the action that is required there is to monitor and engage in the development of those solutions in a way that helps them evolve and emerge in a way that is viable. So if you can think about it in those three categories, you can then start to map out a fairly strategic long-term roadmap to demonstrate how you are going to get to net zero. And that's important now because stakeholders are looking for that kind of evidence, that kind of information, that your business strategy is robust in the light of the net zero transition and other climate-related risks.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because obviously there's legislation coming down. Some of that is actually hitting our energy prices right now. Just the way that the energy prices are set up, we're actually there are taxes in inverted commas associated with our currently kilowatt hour costs that is supposed to be going towards that. We can have a totally separate debate on that, but that's probably not for today. But it's basically putting an additional burden on high energy users currently for jam tomorrow. And clearly there will be jam tomorrow, but in terms of convincing someone who's got a cash flow thing that they're looking at their profitability over the next 12 months. Jam tomorrow is jam too late, isn't it? I mean, Andy, it'd be good to your thoughts on that in terms of clearly there will be certain businesses that will succeed and will get through there, but there may be some losers as well in terms of businesses that may not be able to get through that transition if they don't at least start planning soon.
Well, I think one of the chilling statistics that James shared with us earlier was the level of investment that's taking place within the UK, and it's sustained at that lower level. If you're sitting there right now as an investor looking at where is the best place for you to be producing, high-end polymers or sophisticated chemicals which require a lot of energies, to go into them, it's quite clear it's going to be very, very hard indeed for that to be profitable here in the UK with energy prices as they stand at the moment. So why would you invest there right now? Of course, for an industry, we've got to do everything that we can to make it as profitable as we can in the short term, but there needs to be some answer to the medium-term question. We're seeing it right the way across Europe as well. The heartlands of large process chemical industries in Germany and the Netherlands that have historically been very profitable and very strong indeed. They don't have high levels of confidence right now. When you meet with them and speak to them, they're on, let's just keep things ticking over until the energy prices sort of come back down, but they don't feel particularly tightly in control of that. So I don't think that picture on the energy front is something that, as a manufacturer, people feel they have a much control over. And perhaps that's true. So perhaps that's back to government to be talking about how do we create an environment, a little bit more of a level playing field, so that the very talented and very capable people out there who are running these large plants and some of the smaller ones that have been well invested in over many years have the opportunity to thrive and continue to thrive for hopefully many decades to come.
Yeah, just on that, James, I don't know if you can pop your camera on, but it kind of I kind of warned you about this, but but obviously the industrial strategy could well have a significant role to play in a number of different aspects in terms of people's, their sentiment towards investment, but also I guess in the more acute timeline in terms of energy as well. It'd be good to get your thoughts on that in terms of what the anticipation is and maybe what the expectation around the delay is and what we can actually expect to see.
Yeah, well, just to start off, I mean, to put it bluntly, and I think particularly in the past month or so, I think it would be the view of ourselves, Make UK, and most other production-based business organizations that if the industrial strategy will be considered a failure if it doesn't address something on energy. Now, we have views about it should do, almost separate to the industrial strategy. We're almost considering it a point of crisis. The panels talked about it at length and about the sector. In order to remain competitive, the UK manufacturers effectively have to find supernormal efficiencies relative to their European peers and competitors. Just because of that differential that we're talking about. So in order to remain competitive, they've got to find more elsewhere because it's such a major factor of production. It really is a threat to the UK's competitiveness, the overall UK PLC's competitiveness on the market, the ability to be able to price like for like goods when your core factor of production is so much higher. What's the solution here? I'll just go on a tangent a little bit. There's lots of questions saying like, well, how do we go about this? One of the arguments, because we can't stick our head in the sand. Particularly, let's say in the case of France, they've effectively paid off the mortgage on their nuclear generation, so they have the means of source of relative cost. But the thing that we have here in the UK in the industrial market is a few things. First of all, it's unregulated, which is a rather unique phenomenon, unlike the domestic price cap for consumers. There's an argument coming in that something like a fixed strike price would be beneficial, in effect practicing like an off-gen price cap for consumers, just administered in a slightly different way. And the other one is offloading the policy costs. So the policy costs being those contributions towards those net zero initiatives, moving it onto the Treasury. Now it's a very testing point because of course the net sterling cost of that intervention would be massive compared to what it is. But frankly, as I think a lot of us can see, if nothing is done on energy and no vision is taken, if we are to march forward on this onwards path, the competitiveness of the UK's production sector is just going to be continually eroded. And of course, there's a very pessimistic thing to say, I know, but once you lose it, you don't get it back. So once it's gone, and then the challenge is then you have the services sector has less to service within the UK. So it can, from our point of view, and of course we're going to be a little biased because we're Make UK, but we do think this is the truth, that if we don't change course, particularly on energy, and that's just a very identifiable thing we can grab. I'm not saying it's the be all and end all of challenges for the sector, but that's one that's quite easy to understand and identifiable. It will be a one-way street into eroding competitiveness. So now onto the positive comment. Industrial strategy, it has this opportunity, right? We're on the precipice of something that should be fantastic for the sector. We've long harked on about, we've had 8 or more failed industrial strategies in the past 10 years, which is rather ironically antithetical to the point of an industrial strategy, to create that long-term stability for the sector so that it can invest, it has confidence about, well, if I put this money down over 7 years, it's going to be worth it. The carpet's not going to be pulled. We've got, a strong policy framework to grow and invest in the UK. I think what's coming around the corner, no, the delaying of it over the past couple of weeks doesn't give anyone a huge amount of confidence. We, of course, full disclosure, probably not so much so in the past couple of months, but Mickey K has worked very closely with the colleagues in DBT and various other departments, to work at what should form part of industrial strategy. It should go so long, of course. We launched in partnership the introduction of the Industrial Strategy Council, which exists to see that long-term over successive governments to hold government to account so that it can't be chopped and changed at the behest of the sector. But I just think in the last couple of months it's got a little quiet. It's being kicked down the road a little bit over the past couple of weeks, and that makes us nervous. I also think, set against the backdrop of quite infamously across wider Treasury spending, we're hearing that in the spending review. We heard it back in the budget. We're hearing it in between is a degree of sort of tightness around money. We're talking, black holes, it's much to spend. And frankly, most of these interventions that would need to form part of industrial strategy, they can't just be words on paper. And with the elephant in the room, the example I gave earlier, energy. And it's inevitable that that's going to cost money. And it's about convincing the wider economy and government that this is the strategy to take forwards. We're going to have, it's very important that despite the Treasury challenges around available liquidity, we can't park this off to 4 years. Because in the meantime, we'll just then lose even more, a greater proportion of our competitiveness in that meantime that we won't see back. So hopeful, and I think there are characters in government that are really attuned to this. And I just hope that what's the delay right now isn't a red pen being taken to it.
Yeah. Thanks, James. Super. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm going to open it up. Val, have we got any questions? I'm just conscious of time that we've kind of hit half past. Are there any questions that we might want to quickly pick up?
Yeah, we've got a couple which are both around the theme of costs around net zero. So Howard, if quickly to yourself, how much is the net zero transition going to cost?
Thanks. What a great question. And it'd be different for every business, won't it? But if I can sort of take a sort of an abstract approach to answering that question. So the future is going to cost, right? So net zero is actually probably the least costly future that we face. Failing to achieve net zero will mean that climate change accelerates further, and the climate will impact our economy way worse than the transition to net zero. So, various studies have been done that indicate, to get to a state of net zero, you need to invest, and that might cost, say, 1 or 1.5% of GDP on an annual basis. It's very difficult to predict, but that's a sort of ballpark that I've seen. Whereas if you don't get to net zero, then the cost could be more like 3 or 4% of GDP as a result of the impacts of climate change. And those costs will not be borne equally across society. And there will be some, perhaps those that are more exposed to physical impacts of climate change might bear the costs of not transitioning, whereas those that are more aligned to carbon intensive activity might bear more of the costs of the transition. But on the whole, it'll save money to transition, and that'll be true on average for every single business household person in the world, on average. So I think that's probably the best answer: is don't view it as a cost. Think of it as actually the future is going to require innovation, change, regardless. And if you can put your money into transitioning to net zero, that will, in the end, make you more competitive, and it'll be the least costly option.
Thanks, Howard. And Andy, quickly just to yourself, how much energy is it reasonable to expect a manufacturing business to save without investing in expensive capital expenditure?
Yeah, thank you, Val. I think it's, again, I'm going to start by quoting Howard. It's going to vary. It's going to vary between companies and between industries. But I think what we've seen over the last couple of years is people have really been focusing on this across various industries, including, I mentioned chemicals, but also other industrials, textiles, cement, fast-moving consumer goods, agricultural processes, bioethanol. What we're finding is that it's between 10, 15, even in some cases 18% of their energy bill can be saved without capital expenditure and without any reduction in what they're actually delivering as a manufacturer. So effectively their energy productivity. And this is because, as I said earlier on, it's not necessarily been the highest of priorities in the past. As costs are going up, it's becoming a much higher priority. And when we look at it again with some structure, we're finding good size opportunities, well worth the time and energy that goes into making those savings. So maybe to the listeners, 10, 15% of your energy bill, that saving, that can kickstart the next stage of your net zero journey.
I can add an example onto that, Andy, as well. This is from an organisation with a very large fleet of engineering vans, looking at transitioning to electric vehicles. The cost of fuel was eye-watering. I mean, hundreds of millions on an annual basis, and you could slash that to probably 25%, just if you were able to convert the fleet to electrics. But up until the point where electric vehicles started to become viable, nobody had even thought that massive cost was something that was addressable. And my point is, new technology that you might think of as net zero technology is actually delivering, greater efficiency, greater competitiveness. But sometimes you've got to be a bit imaginative to figure out what those opportunities really are.
Great. Conscious of time, gentlemen, all three of you, thank you very much for joining. I think the main message here that I'm hearing, and but both from you and also from our clients as well, is that when you think about net zero, we're not just talking about the evangelical side of things. There's actual pounds, shillings, and pence improvements to be had, which deliver against your net zero targets, but also deliver against your financial targets as well. So thinking that through, actually having a plan, which is 50% of the people seem to have one, the other half don't, but actually having a plan and understanding both the information required to make improvements that, Andy, you were picking up on, but also an overall view of how we're going to get there, and at least engaging in that conversation and understanding there are some things. Obviously, manufacturers are used to optimizing things day and night, 24/7, but there may well be some levers and some angles that we're thinking about, one which are of no cost whatsoever, but there may also be some additional opportunities which may have a moderate investment requirement, but will deliver significantly towards your net zero targets without going anywhere near the difficult stuff. This is the practical stuff and the stuff that has the technology today to deliver it. The rest of it we can park for tomorrow. But if you get through the first bucket of no-brainers and the second bucket of, well, we might need to put a bit of money in the pot, but it's going to deliver significant benefits, then you're a long way further along that journey than you are potentially currently.